Today, we are going to talk about data and weapons of mass destruction. I want to introduce my lovely panel, starting with Mr. Ed Lawson. He's the Director of Integration for the Joint Program Executive Office for Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Defense. Mr. Sam Lee, the Intel Section Chief for the FBI's WMD Directorate. Ms. Amanda Richardson, the Chief of R&D Operations, Research and Development Directorate for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Dr. Donna Wilt, the Senior Scientist and Strategic Advisor for Noblis. And I am Lauren Williams. I am the Defense Reporter for FCW and Defense Systems. And so we're going to get started, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. So we're going to jump right in, and I want you guys to each kind of rattle off what are the most imposing threats in each of your spaces, and how are you working to mitigate them? You can start.
All right. Yeah, I'll start. I'm Ed Lawson. I'm the Director of Integration at the Joint Program Executive Office for CBR and Defense. We've recently undergone a reorganization and a reshaping of culture and in management. The National Defense Strategy and National Security Strategies have driven us to get at a little bit more effective way of looking at threats. Our biggest challenge right now is, as a material developer, we work directly with industry. Users and requirements, they don't know what they need. They think they know what they need, but the art of the possible, as is mentioned earlier, that's one of our biggest gaps. But I tell you, I like to look at the larger picture as the Director of Integration, and I'm looking at the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy, and I'm looking for an executive order. Catastrophic is the way WMD is characterized. Every other catastrophic event that's characterized in those documents have an executive order to follow them, to coordinate and facilitate all across government. There is no authority there. And excuse me if I sound a little passionate about this, because I struggle every day with everybody's opinions. And I look at things from two perspectives. You have authorities and you have resources. If you have authority with no resources, you're a figurehead. If you have resources with no authority, you're a cash cow. Okay, so how do we balance that? As the material developer, I look at the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy, and I look at catastrophic events. But when you look at the budget, to include DHSs, doesn't symbolize the catastrophic. The speed of effects, the impacts that it will have. How do you get the whole of government across, and how do you get them together to understand the speed of effects that the enemy can employ before we can even detect? Those threats, they're real. It's overwhelming. I visit combatant commanders. I visit embassies. You lay that in front of an ambassador. You lay it in front of a combatant commander. He has no tools. He can't do anything with it. Yet we continue to talk, but not walk. And so my biggest concern right now is I'm trying to get to technology. I'm trying to reach beyond, and I have a limitation of user competencies that are relying on current policies, yet they want something different. And then I have no overarching strategy that I can plug into, which I can measure success. And when I look at funding and I look at authorities, they don't match up. So for me, that's my biggest, and I feel it with industry, because I know you guys have the solutions. It's kind of trying to, I hate to use the analogy, but when you're trying to give someone something and they just don't want it, or they can't understand how to use it, I always break out my cell phone and I said, if I gave you an iPhone 10 years ago, you wouldn't have wanted it, but now nobody goes without it. That's what we've got to do. Build it, try it. If I give somebody a 50% solution, they're going to give it back to me at 10% and broken, or they're going to give it back to me at 80% with a fix. So my challenge is top level. How do I tie catastrophic? How do I measure success? How do I find solutions? And then, again, the requirement, and how do I take that requirement with the funding and no tie to an overarching strategy to get after that?
Amanda.
I'm Amanda Richardson. I work at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, and I'm actually in our Research and Development Directorate. But I'd like to build on a lot of things that Ed said, and we work very closely with Ed and his group. One of the struggles I think that the government has is that this is a lower probability event with very high consequence, and we don't really know how to address non-probabilistic risk. It's a struggle. That said, I do think it's interesting because we're seeing some evolution where we have those really high consequence events that are low probability, but then we're seeing the utilization of some of these threats in new and different ways, and we're seeing that happen more frequently some. So we have to balance how do we address those threats that are perhaps lower impact but still very scary, and then how are we still addressing the true catastrophic risk as well. But one of the things that we've been shifting toward, again, to align better with the National Defense Strategy, is how we look across the entire spectrum. And here I'll talk about kind of two spectra, both the threat spectrum, so everything from chemical, biological, nuclear, low-level, high-level consequence events, but then also the timeline spectrum. So how do we get in front of it as much as possible? How do we find not just the actual weapon that they're about to use, but how do we find the people who are buying the precursors for that weapon? How do we find the people who are looking for money to do that? How do we find the people who are just researching but interested in that? So backing up and getting ahead of those events as much as possible. So looking at that entire threat network, not just the capabilities to defeat the weapon before something happens, hopefully, or clean up after an event, but even how are we getting at all of the data so that we're finding those precursors, the laboratories, the facilities that they're using ahead of time and trying to get after that. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is, as you've already heard this morning, and I suspect you're going to hear a lot today, is trying to work collaboratively, because as Ed said, the budget is there, but it's dispersed across the government, and it's not a huge budget in the WMD space. So we are trying to work collaboratively with DHS, with DOJ, with Department of Energy, and with industry to figure out how we can do this to the best of our abilities. But there's always room for improved collaboration there, I think.
Sam?
Yes, Sam Lee, FBI Intelligence Analysis Section. So some of the same things that we've talked about here, what we look at it, since we're kind of looking at the main aspect of prevention and identification. So I kind of look at proliferation, speed, and then location. So proliferation, we'll look at the proliferation of knowledge. You know, things that used to be pretty much held safe with nation states or with private industry or academia with regard to developing whether it's WMD or CBRNE materials. So that has very much been proliferated to almost the individual. So basically that leads into the speed. So the speed of knowledge is what I kind of look at. So the ability for people to be able to understand and get things that normally would take quite some time to get. So that shortens our time to be able to identify, to be able to either respond, prevent, or respond to any type of event. In location, I kind of look at it from a couple different areas. One, I look at location from now. You go from where you may have had an academic lab or a company lab to DIY type lab that can be anywhere, from someone's garage to a storage facility to location that I also use as the global marketplace. Just with any kind of industry, we've gone from where we had Main Street, where all of our companies were, to like a global space for any type of industry or commerce. Well, that has proliferated as well within the WMD community, and sometimes for the nefarious means, so the dark web or places where individuals go to get access to any type of CBRNE material. Makes it a lot more difficult for traditional means to be able to again identify, deter, and to get those individuals. And with the constant changing in technology and the ability to be able to identify those individuals has become even more difficult for us. So, biggest threats are those for me: proliferation of knowledge and the ease by which people can actually get that information to do something bad. The other part that we've seen a lot is the delivery systems. I mean, everybody's pretty much understands traditional delivery systems from a nation state, with regard to delivering some type of a weapon. But we look now at like UXS technology, so basically unmanned aerial systems, submersibles, or even land vehicles that people use to deliver some type of WMD material. We also look at some of the things we're trying to do to combat that is We have an emerging threats and technology unit that we actually have deployed down to Huntsville, Alabama, which some federal government entities are going down there because of just the nature of the Redstone arsenal. So their goal there is to try to help to identify those new emerging threats, those things hopefully we can get ahead of before it actually becomes, something bad. So we're looking at some advanced detection capabilities, whether it's with regard to bio or chem side, everything from 2 levels of the spectrum, from like nerve agent detection and down to maybe even like fentanyl, which we kind of look both from a criminal aspect, which can be used for drugs, to even be actually applied as a chemical agent. So some of the things we're trying to do, we do try to do outreach, tripwires. Again, our goal, I try to ask everybody, if an event happens, you want somebody to respond, you want somebody to hold people accountable, but if you had your choice to choose between response and prevention, you choose prevention probably every single day. So that is the hard part, how you measure prevention. So we always try to have tripwires and try to have people out there to help us to identify indicators so that we can try to get ahead of the threat. And staying ahead of the threat is a full-time job this week. So.
Donna?
Yeah, so I'm with Noblis. My name is Donna Wilt, and I'm currently supporting the CWMD, the DHS's CWMD office. And as a kind of representing the industry view, I wanted to bring
You passed.
I wanted to bring up 2 points to think about the threat from an outcome-based consideration. And so 2 of the main issues, as we talk about trying to move into what we call left of boom and into kind of this digital age, 2 things we got to think about is, 1, who controls the data, and by controlling the data, if we're going to privatization, how that lets them control the narrative of what the data says and how you kind of counter those kind of activities. And then also both the threat of what that data might do from an economic impact. I mean, probably you guys saw that Peloton ad, and the next day they said, the company lost $940 million. So one 30-second spot just tanked a company. So kind of when you talk about data and you get back to this question of, you want to use it, how do you figure out a way that you're not going to jeopardize someone's economic risk because it came from them, or the outbreak started there, or whatever those things are. And so in addition to kind of identifying who you want to target, it's really important to figure out how you're going to target and the threats that are associated with that and the approaches for its unintended consequences and the implications of what even making that information known is. So that's kind of some of the ways that we think about threat as well.
And to kind of build on this conversation, do you think that the current tools and solutions available to monitor and mitigate these threats are sufficient? And if not, what can be done about them?
Yeah, we'll just run down the line here. I'll take the first stab. The short answer is no. User competency is at an all-time low in compared to technology. Technology is moving too fast. Concepts, policies are lagging, right? There's no agility. People talk agility, but then they close their doors. You set up departments. You have org structures. You have all of this stuff while the enemy looks as we build seams. We build seams between agencies. There was a discussion earlier about overlap. Overlap is good. Overlap is not bad. If I'm going to break something, I'm going to punch it in the seam. And that's what we do. We build seams. So the tools that we have, yes, individually, they may be doing something, but it goes back to that overarching driver. Who's monitoring success? Who's actually, individually, we're doing great stuff, but collectively, where are we showing that success? And one of the areas that we looked at is the intelligence. Everybody has their own intelligence. Intel will tell you it's information until it's processed and it becomes intelligence, right? But I can outspeed intelligence by looking at Twitter, right? So I don't fall victim to that. We're using old policies and old structures, and we're trying to build old tools. We're not building new tools. It's taking a hammer and just walking around and hitting everything. We're not getting anywhere. A prime example is digital engineering. We talk about the digital age. Us as the JPEO and the OSD in the Department of Defense, we're leading a lot of the discussions on digital engineering. A program executive office where we can model systems, we can model threat in the digital age with all the technology that we've got right now. We can model this stuff in a low-threat, high-payoff environment, yet we still have no national-level exercise where we can actually do that, even in segments. Northcom has tried it. DHS does it. JPEO does it. DOD does it. But that whole-of-government approach in the competition phase, we are missing out. We are losing the battle in the competition phase. And I'll go back to the military aspects of this. Whole of government. There is no more clean lines between conflict and that lower than conflict. You know, we are at conflict all the time. And where the DOD gets called in, that's where our space is. We don't even recognize that space. We go back to our old policies, our old authorities. DOD fights for the away game other than our National Guard. We're with a peer now. Where's our home game? Everything I've got in my portfolio is for deployment OCONUS. I've got National Guards, 55 CSTs out there for Homeland. Do you think DHS is going to be overwhelmed? A tactical employment of a WMD has strategic effects. Think about that. Usually tactical weapons, nuclear, okay, small ones, does that have a strategic effect? No, not really. Not where we're concerned. It's kind of clean. But now we are looking at weapons of mass destruction with no attribution, and then the separation of allies and governments, just like Saudi Arabia right now. You think they're feeling a little bit of a pinch of those folks being grounded? So I think one of the biggest gaps that we have is we're still not coming together and seeing the picture holistically as a government, as our role in the world and what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be partners. We're not supposed to be, the people on the block taking care of our individual blocks. We've got to take care of as much as we can.
I feel like you have I want to build on some of the things that you've said, though. I do think that the more recent defense strategies and defense commentary about being able to engage below the level of armed conflict lead us to places where we will want to engage even further with DHS, with DOJ, with the folks who do have that domestic mission, because a lot of the tactics and tools that we've developed for armed conflict but have also been leveraging in smaller ways, and particularly for some of our more unique customers that may be doing smaller engagements. There, we have developed tools that can be leveraged in the homeland as well. So I think there are opportunities there, but you raised a great point about the whole of government approach. And I think a lot of the exercises that are run kind of get to, okay, an attack tool nuke was deployed, indexed, and they don't go beyond that. What do we do then? And that's really where the game begins for the people sitting up here. We're like, no, we need to talk about that too. And we have a lot of information to help support us, and how would we do that? But we haven't dug into that. And I think one of the challenges we have is there's so much information out there. Where do we begin? And developing tools to help us sift through the data that's available using Twitter, which actually has proven to be quite good. Social media can be a really good indicator of things like outbreaks, and not necessarily linked to a biological weapon, but just people start getting sick and they post on social media about it. And if you're tracking that, that may be a better indicator than the public health reporting systems that exist. But how do we sort through that data? How do we track it? How do we get after all of that? And there's a lot of data out there and a lot of tools that aren't necessarily built to do that. And that's where we have to work together to build the tools that we need to do this as a whole. Because I think you're right. We need to succeed together, but without those measures of success individually or as an enterprise, as a government enterprise, as a U.S. enterprise, it's hard to tell that story of how are we succeeding, because we don't really know what defines success. Sam, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll build a little bit. So a couple of things. I'll talk about the response aspect, which kind of leads to how you identify, which brings all those into it. One of the biggest things we find, too, is there are individuals who are doing some sort of nefarious activity, but we have found the majority of the impact, the majority of the place we try to focus some attention is insider threat. So the individuals who have access to materials is usually where we can have force multipliers with government, with industry, with academia. And coming from where we come, sometimes everybody thinks we're trying to stop all of those, and it's typically not the case. Our goal is to educate and inform others of those vulnerabilities within their own space. so that they can identify anything that's unusual, and in that way that can help us help them. So that's kind of one of the biggest ways we try to help, as a tripwire. The response part that we have a problem with, because we have that mission as well too, is whether it's sensing technology, false positives. We've been hit with the FBI with white powder letters from as long as I can remember. The majority of the time, those have a tendency to be, not valid. However, we cannot not respond. But that's time and resources, that's money, that's taking away from something else that you need to do. We had a recent thing several months ago where it was one state. I'm also a National Guard officer as well too, so we had the CST teams that kind of went out and found a material, and they used their sensor, and then they used a secondary source to sense it, and it was the same technology, so it gave the exact same reading. So in essence, they're validating themselves. Well, when we used our sensors, which were a little bit more in-depth involved, we got a different reading. So again, it's that same thing, being as, we got to respond quickly in this day and age. However, sometimes you need to take a break to be able to think and assess that situation to determine, what you need to do, because we can't always respond to every single event, but at the same time, we don't want to respond when it's something that could be a big thing, like the Boston Marathon. If I go back to that as an example, prior to that, you may not have tracked as much what was going on. The event happens, then everybody comes back and says, "Hey, why weren't you tracking all these people?" After the fact, it's kind of hard, to go back prior to that to know all that kind of information, because you don't see that. So I think it's just that fidelity, that ability to have the information that helps you to identify on the front end. And that's where we've noticed we can have technology to help out with that, but nothing beats the human aspect. And so that's why we try to work as much as we can with, it's not just us trying to tell everybody else what to do, it's us working in partnership with other federal agencies, with other state and local governments, with academia, with the private sector. Everyone can be leveraged to help us to identify what's out there so that we can be at the right place at the right time.
And Sam,
Yep.
the Boston bomber, use of WMD was the charge, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Very interesting point. That very point there, the use of WMD for an explosive device in the judicial part of this, very interesting what that means. If you understand their roles and their missions and what could happen with that charge versus just a conventional piece, it's very interesting.
So I'm going to add a counterpoint, and I'm going to say that, as representing industry, and I'm sure many of you in the room have developed some really great tools to tackle this problem, and a lot of them we can't necessarily talk about in the open forum. And so, but we're doing some pretty incredible things to kind of counter threats and detect WMD in the information age and in a variety of ways. So in some cases, I think I'm going to agree that part of the issue is figuring out how to transfer some of those lessons learned maybe in maybe a financial tracking space into this WMD threat tracking space, or some of those things that we kind of do, that there's an issue. But there's also sort of the larger problem as the government recognizes they got to work this as a whole of government issue, you're still going to have separated contracts for industry. So how and what kind of responsibility does industry have to kind of work together where you have competencies in one space to help create those connectivities and those linkages? So I would say there's kind of there's definitely better tools. We have some where we're really good. We have a pretty good capability to catch things, but we're always going to have these events where there's hindsight that says, oh, we should have tracked that. And so part of the challenge as we go forward is figuring out how to look at all that data with a limited amount of people to be able to make those connections, to understand what those signatures are and those implications, and not have to go back and say what if. And so that's kind of my counterpoint to what we were talking about.
I think it's well taken though, right? Hindsight's always 20/20. It's easy to look back and say, oh, I wish we'd collaborated more. But it is difficult. But to your point about the contracts, I think one of the things that, from the government perspective, the contract may be let by DOD or DOJ or what have you, but we can work collaboratively in terms of funding or in terms of further development. DTRA does a lot of science and technology, more early development, and then we transition things for more advanced development. ED's organization being one of our partners, but one of many partners. We've also worked with DHS. We've worked with Health and Human Services. We've worked with a variety of further partners. We've done things for the CSTs that are then leveraged across the National Guard Bureau and then end up in state and local organizations as well. So I think trying to build those partnerships early on so that we can build effective transition plans for those things will help us get after some of that and help us better leverage the best of class in industry solutions. Because otherwise, we are sort of building our silos of excellence. You know, DoD's got this solution, and it's not even a whole of DoD solution, maybe. It may be, here's DITRA's solution, and then Ed's over here with a different idea, and you know, the services and on down the line. So we really have to work at building those bridges early on and looking at what's available then, and then that helps us get after some of that. So I think your point's very well taken there.
And I think there's, you know, somewhat of an onus on industry as well to, you know, we senior leaders only have so much time, right? So we would love national level exercises about everything, but at the same time, you know, they're busy running the country. And so at some point, you have to anticipate what you think it might be and do your best you can, but being prepared for it in a way that you can seamlessly open it and give it to the seniors when they need it is great. And so that idea of kind of figuring out ways to expand the space with which you think about the problems as you're exercising it, I mean, we need it.
I want to kind of build on this because we're talking a lot about data proliferation and how much data there is, and that data not necessarily turning into actionable information, and also how industry can help the government with these problems. But there's also a security issue there. I know that there's definitely a large focus in Congress. The NDAA conference report just came out, and there's a big focus on supply chain security, particularly when it comes to weapons systems. And so I want to kind of get your perspectives on how you tackle those sort of challenges when it comes to data, when it comes to security in the WMD space.
So from the material development, there's this thing called risk, right? And it seems we're risk averse. Body armor doesn't protect your whole body. It protects the vital organs. So there's a risk. When I take a hill, I'm willing to lose 25%, right? That's my first cut. There's no risk in WMD. Everybody wants total protection all the time, and they want information all the time. Well, I can tell you, I'm a former Marine, or am a Marine, and I don't need exquisite. I need go, no go. That's all I need. I don't care what it is. I go or I no go. That's very simple. We've gone exquisite. We're data rich and intelligence poor or information poor. There's too much data. You're overloaded. My phone has so much stuff on it. I just want to call somebody, right? That's all I want. You know, my kids got all that. I don't understand it. I don't understand my phone. But I have a focus. I have a mission. So some of the things that we're trying to understand is, how does data get processed, right? And where does it go? And how do I publish and subscribe? So when I talk to industry, they built systems for us years ago that have so much sensing capability and so much data that's being compiled, but we only ask for one chapter of it, and we ask for probably the most disjointed chapter. And then we never put any kind of streaming on it, or I only need a bit of information from that. I only want 5 paragraphs from that chapter. So how do we publish data, and how do we subscribe to data? In the near fight, I'm not making decisions. I don't have luxury to think. I react. So I need one bit of information, red light, green light. And then when I get further back, then that's when I start talking about that. But risk. If you haven't seen it, there's a JAROCM out. It's called Joint and All Domains Command and Control. It's called JADC2. And in that JAROCM, the chairman and the SecDef have directed accepting risk under secure and non-secure networks and infrastructure. You have to layer it, because sometimes you just have to make a decision. No decision is the worst decision. Just make a decision, Lieutenant. So that's really where I'm trying to understand is, how do I now take my legacy systems, open them up, and see the possibility of what information and how I can stream it and where I can stream it to? Because in the close fight, if you look, in the future, there's going to be no man in the close fight. it's going to be unmanned. And man is going to be in that secondary ring, because those are going to be your indicators of what man really needs to do. So that data is going to become more and more important on how it's being published and how it's being subscribed, but more importantly, how you layer it. That's going to be the key right there, because as you go through the filters and it continues to go, then you can have some validation.
So in some ways, what you're arguing for is, even though you have all the data, you still need smart SMEs to be able to figure out how to parse it in a way that meets what the end user's need is. So you're never going to get away from, you're never going to build a tool that does that all automatically for you.
Yeah. I mean, you're stepping in a slippery slope when you start saying a tool's going to do everything and there is no man and we're just going to press buttons. The human element to this, it has to be there. The anticipatory piece of this has to be there, because as soon as the enemy knows that you're relying on machines and you have a protocol, they're going to change, just like they always do. It's the human element to this. But you can't rely on just machines and the automation. And that's why I talked about user competencies. Our limiting factor right now is user competencies and understanding, how do I pull this all together?
Well, I think some of it also has to do with, as you said, we've got legacy systems that have decades of data available to us, but how we layer that with current data also builds on a need for better data curation, because they don't have a common data architecture. We do not have a common data architecture. So I have data, you have data, you have data, we all have data, but getting it into a form that we can use in a single tool is a pipe dream at this point, I think, just because of the volume of data. But data architecture is a big point of conversation right now. We're working on that just internal to our agency, much less what DoD is going to do and what the government's going to do. But being able to leverage more data gives us more information to help us better respond to potential risks, potential threats. And we need to be working on that architecture, that curation, such that then we make more data available to us. And I think that we are trying to work toward a place where we can leverage a lot of AI tools, a lot of advanced data analytics tools to help us not take the human out of the loop completely. We'll still need that human in the loop. But how can we help narrow down the field of that data? Because when we have the world at our fingertips in terms of data, a human can't possibly sort through all of that very quickly. And so we do need to narrow down the scope. And that's where we can use some advanced data analytics tools. But we have to create those tools. They don't exist for every problem that we have right now. There are a variety of things that we can leverage. There are some great tools available to us. And some of it's finding those tools. Some of it's creating the brand new tools that we need. Some of it's taking tools that exist and modifying them to answer some of the questions that we're looking at. But I think it all comes back to that initial data architecture and data curation. How do we get to a place where we can use more of our data?
Yeah, and you know, another analogy that we like to use, the best backhoe digger, I know this is going to be, I'm a dirt guy, right? So the best backhoe digger that you will have on your team is the guy that shoveled the hole, right? Mm-hmm. If you've only sat in the backhoe and you've never been on the ground and done that, you're not going to be effective. There are things that you have to be there to feel, to know, to understand, and have awareness of. You just can't jump in a backhoe and start digging holes. You got to start on the ground and do it, and then you understand. So kids today, I was a director of a school, kids today, they love automation. They would hit a button, and it would come up on the screen, and they said, there's the answer. I said, don't you think that doesn't look right? I went back to old pencil. Jeff Muse sitting right there, he and I worked together. We went back to old stubby pencil on computations on everything. Because once you hit that button, you've got to understand what pops up on that screen. You can't trust the screen. The system's supposed to work for you. You don't work for the system. And we've gotten the other way around. Well, the screen says so. How many times you hear it? Email's down, I might as well go home. Well, yeah, there's this thing, it's called legs, and you can move from another office in a phone, right? Have a conversation with someone. We're over-relying on technology, but don't forget the basics. Because in DOD and the Marine Corps, I love this about the Marine Corps, you can say all you want to say, but at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to look somebody else in the eye and say, I'm taking this piece of ground from you. And they have to concede. So we can't forget that aspect of it, of just don't over-rely on technology.
I want to open it up for questions.
I can hear you.
Everybody can hear me.
We hear you.
Now it's definitely. How about this?
No.
I'll just talk.
Use your command voice.
I'll talk loudly. So I'm Pete Godston with UIs, and Amanda talked a little bit about the tools that you're looking to marshal, and there's certainly an incredible number, and keeping a handle on what's best is a challenge. And I'm not going to advertise for Google, but I would argue they probably think they've got the final solution for you there. My question actually is about the data. So in addition to the tools you mentioned, we're looking for more data. And I think for those of us who grew up in an Intel community from the 80s and 90s, when we see some of the amount of data that we're collecting on citizens of America, we're concerned about the Fourth Amendment. And I just, my question for you is, how do we address that moving forward? Because I do feel, unlike comments I heard as early as the early 90s when I worked at Sun Microsystems, forget about privacy. There's no such thing as privacy. There should be privacy, and our government should be protecting that, in my opinion. And I imagine I'm not the only one in the room who feels that way.
Well, if we go down the line, mine's going to be pretty quick. I can't help you, man. I don't know. When you talk about Fourth Amendment, that's so far out for me. I don't know how you, not to say that I'm not interested, because I want my privacy too, but from my perspective, where I sit and in my organization, my head's in the sand, I guess, on that. So I apologize for my lack of answer.
I'll just say it's kind of an interesting, it's a tough challenge to bring into any solution space. It's a constraint that needs to be considered in the way you access data and what you do with it. But in the same sense, when you're thinking about it from a governmental perspective, people have already given their privacy to the private sector. It's kind of that risk I talked about at the start, which is data privatization. So how do you, being prepared to counter a narrative that may come from someplace, from our adversaries using it or whatever ways, having tools or things that can counter what might already be out there, because the public gives away so much of their private data to private organizations. So it's definitely something you got to consider and build into the constraint relative to everything that you do and the solutions that you provide. But it's also a counter issue that you have to be aware of if you're going to do counter WMD.
No. I understand the risk that you're trying to address, and certainly,
no one wants to see a catastrophic explosion or a chemical event or even a mass shooting. But for example, during the FBI announcement after the shooting down in Florida on the naval base, there was a discussion about, this is considered a terrorist incident, so that invokes all of these other, sources and tools. And I knew exactly what they were talking about. And so again, as an intelligence professional, back in the 90s, if you took your assets and you looked at a U.S. citizen, there was a good chance you might be going to jail. You'd certainly get fired if you were caught. It seems to have changed. And so the question is, how do we as a government protect our citizens? I still believe the Fourth Amendment is valid, and it does get at the heart of what freedom is, I think, in some cases. So it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I'll answer some of that. It kind of goes back to, I was thinking when they were going down the security issue, and it goes back to the previous comment that I had. We're unique in regard to, we have a dual mission. We have a overseas mission, and we actually have domestic mission within the FBI. A lot of the U.S. intelligence community is primarily focused, OCONUS and overseas, which different rules apply. We have it pretty much covered, when it comes to nation states, other governments, and terrorist activity that are happening outside the United States. What makes it difficult for us, because especially in WMD and in the FBI, is that difficulty, because there is U.S. persons have an inalienable right within the country. So that's why I kind of use that Lawson bombing as an example of, we didn't do a lot of those things prior to, because they would have been in violation of that. But like, you know, a lot of times people who are in power, when an event happens, and they come back and say, well, why didn't you do that? But up until that, they're like, well, I don't want you to do that. You know, so you're always in that kind of push-pull. And that's why for us, what we try to do, that's why I tried to say is we can't, some of that stuff we can't do until something happens. And then when something happens, you have authorities, you know, whether you can go after, but it's primarily from a legal aspect and your ability to be able to search certain information. However, with that being said, that's why we do a lot of the outreach, a lot of the work with other people. We try to identify that on the front end so someone can indicate to us. So we're not going out there scrubbing individuals, determining who potentially can be that one individual U.S. person that we're worried about. We're letting you know if you're in a research area in an academic institution, we're not looking and trying to stop, you know, individuals coming in to study, individuals that are in those programs, but we just try to educate individuals there that run the programs. Hey, if you see unusual activity that you would not expect of the norm, you know, then maybe that's something that you would want to let us know so we can help you help yourself. Same thing with private industry. I mean, a lot of things that we see happen, big scale things, happen from someone who is an insider more likely than not. So it's the same thing like, you know, if you use nuclear power plants, you know, the hardened target, the probability of someone actually, you know, breaking into a nuclear power plant to do something is very low. The probability of someone inside who gets disgruntled and wants to do something different is a lot higher. So that's the outreach to them. Hey, be looking for that. Again, the person who's doing something out of the norm, they're staying, you know, later than they should stay. They're accessing a place they shouldn't ask, you know, to be aware of that. We do that with private industry as well. When I was in North Carolina, we had some corporate entities that had facilities there. They worked like sensitive classified projects. So we were able to have classified briefings to them and tell them, hey, this is what you need to be aware of. You look for it. Wasn't very long after that, they reached back out to us where a nation state of interest had already targeted them and hit them. So that's the way we try to reach out. We try to work with them, help us identify, and give us an indicator that we need to focus on someone. We take it very, very seriously, and so that's why it's a rub, you know. I mean, but I think, you know, at least from the people that I see and from where I sit, they take it very seriously, and they don't try to just, you know, put a large net out there, at least within the borders of our country. A little different outside, different authorities apply. So that's the difficulty, and I was kind of talking about it, you know, how do you identify that, whether it's sensors or whether you're identifying from someone else, you know, something has actually happened or events actually happen or about to happen. Those kind of things we need because, like I said, sometimes we don't know till we get the call. I use the white powder letters as an example. We get a lot of those, of course, back when the anthrax, you know, scare happened with Dashwell's office and with, you know, Congress all the way up to now. We still get those. We still have to respond. If we get something that was a potential bio, we still have to respond. We have to assess it, determine where we go from there, where we do. Again, it's resources, it's time that you need to be on the target and assess what's going on. And we try as much as possible to get those indicators, those tripwires out there so people can let us know beforehand because that's the main place we get it unless we're, you know, doing a collection from overseas. I hope that answers kind of what you're looking at, but it is very important for us to do that, and that basically adds a layer of complication to get into there. But that's the world we live in, and I mean, I think we would prefer to have that than to have another option.
On that note,
absolutely.
As much as civil liberties and national security is my jam, and we can talk about this all day, we are over time, and I want to thank my panelists for doing a lovely job and having a great discussion. Thank you so much for being here today.